Today's story is a highly disturbing one. A seemingly idyllic family made of a couple who graciously adopted 5 traumatized children turned into a nightmare of racism, human trafficking, and forced labor. We will be diving deep into the details of this shocking case, detailing the horrific conditions these children endured and the pathetic excuses the adoptive parents gave when they were caught. This case is shocking and heartbreaking, so be prepared as we untangle this dark, twisted web. With that being said, let's just jump right into today's case. Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz were a white couple in their late 50s living in Minnesota when they made the decision to adopt 5 black children, all biological siblings, aged approximately 2 weeks old, 3, 6, 8, and 10 years old. These 5 children have not been named because they are minors, but I did try to do some digging to find out more about them. I was able to gather some information, though details of their backgrounds are pretty limited. What we do know is that it seems like these siblings were all born to the same mother, though I'm not sure if they all have the same father or not. The story begins in 2016 when Jeanne and Donald got the call, informing them of a newborn baby who is ready for adoption. The mother had her 4 other children taken away from her for reasons I'll get into in just a second, so when this baby was born, she was in need of a new home. When the couple picked up the baby and brought her back to their home, they were ecstatic. For the weeks that followed, they started taking her to visit her older siblings, who were all elsewhere in foster care. After those visits, though, Jeanne became adamant on trying to keep all 5 siblings together, so they made the decision to adopt all of them. Now, Jeanne and Donald had been foster parents to over 30 children over the years. They had taken in all sorts of children of all different backgrounds, races, ethnicities, and experiences. They knew that keeping the siblings together would be what was best for them. It was reported that these 4 other children all suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse within the home they shared with their biological mother. Of course, the family was investigated by Child Protective Services, who removed the kids from the care of their mother. By 2018, they were placed under the temporary care of the judge who was presiding over their case. This judge was their legal guardian at the time. So, when Jeanne and Donald stepped up to adopt these kids, it seemed like a blessing. They went through the system to get custody of the kids so they could hopefully provide them with a better life. Up until that time, the couple owned and operated what they called a hobby farm in Foley, Minnesota, where they cared for about 100 animals. They were the only 2 who worked the farm, so it was definitely something manageable for just 2 people. But it seemed like they were in a perfect position to welcome a whole new family into their space. Before placing the children into their care, it was reported that the judge warned the couple that the oldest son, who was now 11 at the time, his mental health was getting worse and worse as he got older. He was beginning to exhibit some concerning and at times maybe even violent behaviors towards his family. He has attempted to run away before and was even hospitalized a few times before being released and sent back to his family. Due to this, the judge suggested that Jeanne and Donald install cameras in their home so that they can keep an eye on the siblings at all times. Feeling up for the challenge, by 2018, the couple officially adopted all of the siblings, moving all 5 children into their home on their farm. At that time, they all started attending therapy to help work through their trauma. Then, shortly after the adoption, by spring of 2019, the family moved to an 80-acre ranch in Tonasket, Washington. This was a pretty isolated area, located around 10 miles away from the next closest town. They did have neighbors, but they weren't really anywhere near them, as you can imagine in these rural farm towns. According to neighbors who did know the family at the time, they seemed to be your typical loving family. Some of the kids were enrolled in school while others were homeschooled. As a family, they sat around the table each night and ate dinner. They celebrated holidays together and went on family vacations. It seemed that even though they were only together for a short time, they quickly bonded as a family unit. Jeanne and Donald said that they did what they could to instill certain values in those kids, giving them a sense of responsibility through helping on the farm and taking care of the animals. But after that move to Washington, the picturesque blended family started to face some troubles. It was reported that the younger 3 children adjusted to the move much easier than the oldest brother and sister. Also, once they were in Washington, all but 1 child stopped attending therapy. Only the oldest son continued therapy because he had the most severe mental health issues of all the siblings. But by that time, there was a delay in getting the oldest son back into therapy after the move. It was mid-2019 when they moved, and as we know, by the end of that year, lockdowns were starting to take effect. They had a really hard time finding him a place to continue his therapy, so during that time, his mental health continued deteriorating. By mid-2020, they were finally able to get him to a therapist who he saw via telehealth sessions. But still, even though he was getting therapy, it seemed that his mental health was worsening. It was around that time in which Jeanne and Donald noticed that the boy, who was 11, would often talk to himself. They'd find him giggling to himself and seemingly having full-on conversations. And when they asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "I'm just talking to myself." At first, they didn't think too much of it because he was just a young boy and children do have quite the imaginations. But as time went on, the talking started occurring more and more frequently. Then he started experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. Once they report that the 11-year-old claimed to see his 3rd-grade teacher from Minnesota in their driveway in Washington. He said she was outside, flying around. This wasn't the only time he expressed seeing things that weren't there, so obviously this was a concern. Donald would later say that he tried helping his son explain these hallucinations, telling him that there was nothing there, but that never seemed to work. At first, he didn't seem to show any real visible signs of aggression or violence towards his siblings or towards his adoptive parents. But as these other symptoms continued appearing, the fights he was having with his siblings and parents were becoming more intense and more frequent. By 2021, Donald claimed that his mental health episodes were becoming a daily occurrence. He started to realize that he wasn't equipped to handle such serious issues, so he was really trying to be consistent with taking him to therapy and getting the professional help he needed. But by the time he was 13 years old in 2022, the boy stopped attending therapy. According to Washington law, apparently a child is given the right to make choices over their own medical treatment once they turn 13 years old. This allowed him to opt out of receiving therapy, so that's exactly what he did. He said that he hated counseling and no longer wanted to go. This was despite the fact that he was continuing to struggle very deeply with his mental health. After stopping therapy as expected, his mental health only worsened, and as a result, so did his behaviors. According to Donald and Jeanne, he started hitting his siblings and even once attacked Jeanne by hitting her with a wood plank and then pushing her to the ground. As a result, Donald started looking for a long-term care facility to admit the boy, but he was having trouble finding anywhere that would take him. Around this time, he was prescribed medication, which did seem to help at least a little bit. During that time, family members would sometimes visit the home to see Donald and Jeanne and try to get to know their new children. Those who visited the home said that the dynamic between the children was always a bit awkward. If they were all together, anytime they asked a child a question, they would turn to the oldest sister to answer for them rather than answering on their own. They were all a bit evasive, not really interacting with each other or engaging with the other adults who visited. Oftentimes, visitors noticed the children staring off into space and being totally disconnected. Either that or the children could be really mean and nasty to one another, not sharing toys or games with one another, and fighting anytime they were each given a toy to play with. When they interacted with the children one-on-one though, like when they weren't all in the same room together, they were actually pretty normal and they seemed just fine. It was just when they were all in a group together that things just seemed really odd. Throughout those years, CPS had been called on the family a few times. Both were related to the oldest boy's behaviors. Once he ended up in the hospital after running away from home. Another time, he was found at school digging through the trash cans to find food because he was so hungry. CPS workers followed up at the home and found that the children had their own beds. The house was clean and stocked with food. Donald explained that one of the medications the boy was on made him extra hungry, so that is why he was digging through the trash, not because he was starving at home. According to records later obtained by law enforcement, this boy had been diagnosed with multiple disorders, including fetal alcohol syndrome, reactive detachment disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar, pica, and restrictive diet disorder. Clearly, he had a lot of issues that were beyond what a parent could handle on their own. He needed serious mental health help, but according to Donald and Jeanne, they were often turned away by their child protective services and by mental health facilities. Then, after spending a few years in Washington, by May of 2023, the family moved to a new home in Sissonville, West Virginia. When asked about why they made this move, Donald said that first, the property taxes in their Washington home were getting out of control. The area where they were living in was experiencing a lot of wildfires, so home insurance companies were starting to deny coverage for people living in that area, so property taxes went up as a result. Another reason was because they wanted to finally get some help for their oldest boy's mental health issues. It seemed like every time Donald sought mental health care for the boy, they were turned away or denied help in one way or another. West Virginia seemed to be somewhere that offered better mental health care. But this move wouldn't end up being the positive change the family was hoping for. Instead, this move ended up being the very thing that would lead to the discovery of the horrors that were truly going on within that home. Like I said, everything I told you up to this point was from Donald's perspective. But after hearing from neighbors and the children themselves, you will learn a whole new side to this story. Now, the family moved into a property which had a house, shed, and a farm. Across the street lived a retired couple who often sat on their front porch looking out. Due to this, they saw a lot of what was going on with their new neighbors, and what they saw really concerned them. The day the family moved into their new home, it was raining out. But according to their neighbors, the kids were made to stand outside for quite a while, getting drenched in the rain. Then they were made to carry massive, heavy items up the hill to their house. They were seen carrying these big, heavy chain link fence panels and big pieces of animal kennels that they set up in the front lawn all by themselves. All the while, Donald and Jeanne just watched them, not helping one bit. This was the first day she saw her new neighbors, but from that point on, this neighbor knew that she needed to keep an eye on them. From there, multiple other neighbors noticed other concerning things. First, they noticed that the children were never seen playing outside. They were only ever working. The children would never interact with one another when they were outside. They just stood there or worked silently. There were multiple occasions in which the children were made to stand in straight lines outside with their heads down for prolonged periods of time. A few days after they moved in, they had a porta potty delivered, which the kids were made to line up by multiple times. It was believed that this was the bathroom that the kids were forced to use while Jeanne and Donald went inside the home in the regular bathroom. Neighbors watched as they were continuously forced to do heavy labor, such as mowing the massive lawn with an old antique push mower, which they knew was very heavy. They were seen carrying full buckets of water, heavy food bags, and propane tanks up the hill or between the home and the farm. This concerned them because these items were clearly too heavy for these children to be carrying. They watched as the oldest boy carried that propane tank, even though he could barely walk. He limped and dragged that tank, acting like his feet were sore and painful. Then, anytime the neighbors saw the kids, it looked like they were usually wearing the same clothes and always looked dirty and exhausted. It also seemed like the children knew exactly what to do and where to go during these chores, because Donald would just stand there and snap at them and point, and they would know exactly where to go and what to carry and what chore to complete. Neighbors never saw Donald helping the children at any time. He would just stand there, snapping at them, pointing, telling them what to do. Then, the most concerning thing of all was when they started to suspect that some of the children were being locked in the shed and forced to sleep outside. One neighbor reported seeing Donald leading 3 children out to the shed, fumbling with the doorknob before going inside with the kids. He then left the shed without the kids, closing the door behind him, and then fumbling with the doorknob and a lock once again. It appeared that the children were being locked inside the shed. As neighbors watched all of this unfolding for months, they became worried for the children's safety and well-being. CPS were called multiple times, but it seemed that for those months, nothing was ever done. But then, neighbors got word that the family was about to move once again. Apparently, Donald and Jeanne were feeling a bit cramped in their home, so they wanted to buy a bigger place. Those retired neighbors were more troubled than ever after seeing them start moving furniture out of their home, because if they moved, they couldn't keep an eye on those kids.
I think it started because the children really wouldn't talk to us. They would look at the parents first before they'd ever say anything. And then some of the different things that they said kind of red flagged us, oh, we thought we'd be more secluded out here.
But it was what they started to see that concerned them the most. The kids doing constant manual labor in the yard, using a porta potty outside. And if the kids weren't working, they were standing still in a line. Miller said they often were in the same clothes and that she never saw them go into the house, always outside in all weather. And the people of Cheyenne Lane all began to take notice.
So they'd be like, hey, I have not seen these kids change. Have you seen these kids change? Nope, they're wearing the same thing from yesterday that they were, or they're from 5 days ago that they had on. So it was involving, you don't want to be suspicious of people, but you are when you start noticing those different details every day are the same thing.
And then came the growing suspicions that the kids were being locked in a shed.
Then, by October 2nd, 2023, the neighbor watched as Donald locked 2 of the kids in the shed before leaving the property. A short time after, they watched as Jeanne also left the property. It was at that time when they decided that enough was enough and finally called the police, who arrived at the property a short time later.
I seen him open the barn door up, and either he whispered to them or he was just making sure that they were still in there at that time, and then he locked it back, and I was standing there watching him the whole time. And he stood there and stared at me for probably 5-7 minutes. What are you going to do about it?
911, where is your emergency?
I'm not sure who I talked to about this. It's more of a wellness check on children.
That's your communication.
But there is a family that we have been calling CPS on multiple times. He has 2 kids locked in an outbuilding.
They went around to the main residence, knocking on the doors, but no one answered. When they went up to the shed, it was locked from the outside. The officer began knocking on the shed for several minutes with no answer, but they could hear movement inside. They called out, saying, "You guys aren't in trouble. We want to make sure you're okay." Finally, a girl spoke up from the inside. She was asked if she had a key or any way out, and she said no. So the officer grabbed a crowbar and made his way inside by jamming the lock open. As they made their way into the shed, they were met with a barrier of heat and a strong smell of body odor. It was so hot inside that shed that as the doors were opened, officers standing 5 feet back were hit with a wave of heat. They found that the oldest girl and boy were locked in that shed, aged 14 and 16, wearing dirty clothes. The boy was barefoot and had open cuts and sores all over his feet. It was clear by the condition of both of them that they had been in that shed for a very, very long time. The teens told the officer that they had been inside that shed all day without any basic necessities, but that was normal for them. In that shed, they found a non-working air conditioning unit installed in the wall, a sleeping bag, camping toilet, cups that appeared to have urine in them, and a cooler with food wrappers inside. They also found cameras which were connected to a surveillance system in the shed as well. There was no running water in the shed. Once they made their way into the main residence, they found a 9-year-old girl up on the loft, alone and crying. There were also security cameras installed in many of the rooms inside the home as well. At the time, like I said, both Donald and Jeanne were out of the home, so after collecting the children and turning them over to CPS, they waited for their arrival. Donald was the first one who returned home, and he had the second youngest child with him. Shortly after he was home, Jeanne also returned home with the youngest child. Both seemed confused why police were there, but after taking the youngest 2 children away, they were immediately taken into the police station. In the meantime, officers interviewed the neighbors to figure out what exactly was going on, and what they told officers is pretty much what I've told you up to this point. Then they went ahead and questioned each of the children about their living conditions, and each child detailed the horrendous abuse and deplorable living conditions under which they were forced to live. I'm kind of going to be putting together what each child said instead of discussing their interviews and testimonies separately, just to avoid being redundant. They said it all started back in Washington, where they were forced to do heavy manual labor on their farm, such as carrying heavy items, pulling weeds and bushes with their bare hands, digging holes for trees, sometimes being forced to dig with their hands as well, and caring for the animals. They were not given free access to food, only being given peanut butter sandwiches or water at scheduled times, some of which were left over from previous meals if they didn't finish it. If they were hungry or thirsty outside of these scheduled meal times, they weren't allowed to eat. They were barely allowed to brush their teeth or shower, with the oldest daughter saying that she once went 2 months without showering or brushing her teeth, again, even though she was doing heavy manual labor and sweating her butt off every single day. Then, once the oldest girl started her period, she wasn't given any menstrual products, even though she begged Jeanne for them. At first, while living in Washington, they did have beds, but eventually Jeanne took them away because she thought they were smelly. Then, Jeanne put up tents for the children to sleep outside, even in the winters, because she thought that the kids smelled too bad to sleep inside. It's almost as if a shower would help with that. As time went on, the physical and verbal abuse just worsened. In addition to the constant heavy labor, they were forced to stand in line with their hands on their heads, unmoving. If they didn't comply or if they moved, they were sprayed with pepper spray. Then they had to stand in their rooms for hours on end, even at night, to prevent them from falling asleep. Sometimes they were forced to stand still for an entire day without a break. There were times where Donald would hit them with a PVC pipe, especially the oldest boy when he would act out. According to the oldest sister, most of the hard labor was in Washington and did continue once they moved to West Virginia. But after some time, they were given fewer tasks. Instead, they just started being locked up in the shed by themselves for prolonged periods of time. Most of the time, the 2 oldest siblings were made to sleep in that shed every night without mattresses. The girl slept in a sleeping bag while her brother slept on the bare floor using a piece of cardboard for a pillow. The door to the shed was only locked from the outside, and the only time they came out was when Jeanne or Donald would unlock it for them. They were typically in there all day, every day. But the oldest daughter went on to say that even if the shed wasn't locked all the time, they probably wouldn't have come out much anyways because they were so afraid of Jeanne. The middle 2 boys in the family, they shared a room inside the home, but they also didn't have mattresses. They had a bucket in that room that they had to use for the toilet, while the other boy would hold up a sheet for privacy. They said that Donald and Jeanne cursed at them all the time, calling them racial slurs and other nasty names. They were called black monkeys, fat pigs, and losers. The youngest girl, who was 5 at the time and was a baby when they originally adopted the siblings, she was given preferential treatment all throughout this time. She would often be made to laugh at her older siblings and call them names along with Jeanne and Donald. Jeanne would tell the older kids that she wished she could just take the youngest girl away with her and only have her. She told the other kids that they would never amount to anything. Now, as you know, I spent a lot of the first part of the video explaining all of the mental health struggles the oldest son had, how he would attack the other siblings and made them fear for their safety. The other siblings did confirm that he struggled with his mental health, even, yes, attacking them or lashing out at times. But it wasn't nearly as severe as Donald and Jeanne made it seem. They all had mental health struggles due to their past trauma. That's something that's going to come with the territory when you're raising foster children. But the other siblings said that they never feared for their safety when it came to their oldest brother. It was basically like your normal sibling fights, nothing that made them think that he was an overly violent or dangerous person. The only people they feared were Donald and Jeanne.
Lantz and Whitefeather kept motion-activated Arlo cameras on the children, one in the shed on the 14-year-old boy and 16-year-old girl, and one in a room upstairs with no bed, only a tarp floor that stayed on the 9-year-old girl and 11-year-old boy. The videos showed a daily routine of waking up early and being forced to stand with hands on head, unable to change or shower, receiving only peanut butter sandwiches to eat before going back to bed on the floor. In the shed, the teens used a camper toilet, holding a sheet up for each other to shield the other from the camera. She went from sleeping on a mattress to the floor with a sleeping bag. Her brother slept on the concrete floor with only cardboard at his head. She said she was forced to be his babysitter, but testified he was never the dangerous, violent kid that Lantz and Whitefeather made him out to be. She recalled also being scared when police arrived at the shed, worried that she would say something to upset Whitefeather.
After hearing all of this information from the neighbors and the children themselves, of course, officers spoke with Jeanne and Donald. As expected, they both denied the claims of abuse. They spoke about the oldest boy's extensive mental health struggles, how they were trying to find him a permanent solution, but they were just constantly being turned away by CPS and mental health facilities. They said that they did install the cameras to watch the kids when they weren't able to actively see them, but it was to protect the oldest boy's safety as well as the safety of his siblings. They wanted to make sure that he wouldn't attack anyone, and as I said earlier, this is something that the judge even recommended they do. They said that they did expect the kids to work the farm, but it was never anything they couldn't handle. It was all done with the intention of teaching the kids personal responsibility. They said that they didn't limit their food or hygiene. Yes, back in Washington, they did set up tents because they knew the kids had never been camping before, but it was done for fun. They were never forced to sleep in the tents, especially not in the cold winters. After their move to West Virginia, they said that at first the two teenagers made the choice to stay in the shed so that they could have some privacy and be away from the rest of the family. It was their hangout spot. They said that all of the children slept on mattresses initially, but it was only after starting their move to their next home that they were packing up the furniture and they packed up the mattresses. The children were only made to sleep on the floor or in sleeping bags for a short time, which they said didn't seem like a big deal to them at all. They said that the door to the shed was never initially locked, but once they did start locking it, the teenagers had a key to the lock so they could get out whenever they wanted, even though the locks were on the outside. The only time they ever locked it was to keep the oldest boy from running away, again, for his own safety. Not really understanding that these two statements contradict themselves. What's the point of locking it if they have a key? But they also said that they locked him in so that he wouldn't run away, but if he had a key and was able to unlock it, he'd be able to run away. None of that makes sense, but we all know that these are lies anyways. Now, like I said, there were security cameras installed in the shed in that home. Of course, officers went ahead and reviewed that footage. What they found over watching 6 days of footage was that the two oldest children were almost always in the barn, as they stated. Over those 6 days, the only time the girl left the shed was when she stepped out for about a minute. Other than that, they were in the shed all day and all night, every single day. They never changed clothes, and both slept on the concrete floor with the girl sleeping in a sleeping bag and the boy with just that cardboard. Throughout those days, the only food they were given were peanut butter sandwiches. Then, cameras from inside the home show video of the middle two children, aged 9 and 11. They found that these kids were made to stand in their room for hours at a time without breaks. They were also heard berating the children for not doing their chores correctly. These two children were also made to sleep on the floor. The only mattress they found in that home was in Jeanne's room. Only she was allowed to sleep on a bed. Only she apparently didn't pack up her mattress, even though everyone else had their mattress packed up. After learning all of this incredibly disturbing information, both Jeanne Whitefeather and Donald Lantz were arrested and charged with human trafficking, gross child neglect, forced labor of a minor, civil rights violations, and child abuse causing injuries. In total, the couple faced a combined 35 charges. A year and a half followed after their arrests as the prosecution worked to build their case. Then finally, by January of 2025, so just a few weeks ago, their trial began. The prosecution argued that this is not a family who lives on a farm with parents who want to teach their kids responsibility. They are racist, abusive adults who physically punished these children to the point of exhaustion just so they could exert their control. They wanted to make the kids comply. They argued that these white parents adopted 5 black children so that they could use them as slaves. They wanted them to do the hard labor on the farm so that they didn't have to anymore. They presented various text message conversations which used racist language, often referring to the kids as dirty and using racial slurs. There were also conversations about the use of whacking sticks on the kids and comparing them to other racial stereotypes. They said that they didn't actually try as hard as they said to get the oldest boy mental health help, given that he wasn't in therapy at the time of their arrest and hadn't been since they moved, despite having a behavioral health center down the street. Even though they said that the move to West Virginia was to get their son mental health help, they never actually made a single call to any mental health facilities to get him in. Instead, they just gave up and locked him away so they didn't have to worry about it. A forensic psychologist testified that yes, the children all had mental health issues. Most of them had PTSD and fetal alcohol syndrome. But the decline of their mental health coincided with their worsening treatment. Yes, they had trauma, but this isn't the only cause of their issues. It was also said that the oldest boy had no documented history of violence towards his siblings or parents throughout his time being treated at the various mental health facilities he went to. Nobody said that he was ever violent or had any dangerous behaviors. They pointed out the conditions of the home, the lack of food, beds, and furniture. They brought up bank records showing that the couple made over $300,000 directly from the state for caring for the kids. They said that they also had sold other properties, making money from that. They had plenty of money to provide these kids with so much more than what they got. They just chose to deprive them. They played various videos that the neighbors took, all of which showed the children doing hard labor. They also showed videos of that surveillance footage, which showed just how long the teenagers were locked in that shed and how severe the physical punishments of the younger children were. Various neighbors testified to what they saw, and most of the children, I believe the oldest 4, all testified to the treatment they endured throughout their time living with Jeanne and Donald. The prosecution claimed that these children were targeted because of their race to be used basically as slaves for their labor.
The video is giving us a glimpse of their daily routine during this time period that started with them waking up at 4:30 in the morning after sleeping on the floor. In the shed, the 2 teens would hold up a sheet for each other while the other used the camper toilet. The rest of their days spent mostly in those rooms standing. At one point, when one of the teens sits down, Whitefeather then comes over the intercom on the camera and she stands back up. You also hear the younger kids ask for permission to leave the room to use the bathroom and brush their teeth.
On Friday, the jury got an inside look at Whitefeather's cell phone. This included text messages between she and Lantz where they referred to the kids as monkeys and pigs. Often Lantz would describe physical punishment where he said he, quote, knocked one of them. We saw one text where Lantz said, quote, somebody didn't say thank you, and his sandwiches disappeared. We also saw more video from Whitefeather's phone from their time in Washington that also showed yelling and physical abuse from Lantz.
On the other hand, the defense claimed that Donald and Jeanne are just two parents who were deeply struggling with their children's mental health issues. They said that CPS failed them so many times, as they often do with other families. They went on to say that even though CPS had been called multiple times, they never found any issues. When they interviewed the children separately, there were never any claims about abuse or racism made by the children. They never mentioned the pepper spraying, the forced labor, or sleeping in the shed. These CPS calls were made before the arrests, obviously, and over the multiple years, and throughout those years, I guess the children never mentioned anything. The defense argued that the children are exaggerating, misremembering, or being untruthful. There's a factor of mental health and past trauma at play here, so that needs to be considered when hearing the testimony from those kids. When explaining the beds, again, they said that they were moving and it was just a temporary thing. No big deal to make the kids sleep on the floor for weeks before they moved, while Jeanne still got to keep her bed. When they explained the shed, they said that the teenagers chose to be in there to get some privacy. There wasn't a lock installed initially, but again, it was later added to prevent the oldest boy from running away. Both Jeanne and Donald took the stand to testify, all talking about how they didn't mistreat the kids, how they aren't racist, and gave explanations for all of the evidence found against them. There were also a few character witnesses who testified saying that they weren't racist. They have Black family members and friends and have fostered all sorts of children. And they weren't targeting these siblings because when they initially got the call for the baby that they picked up from the hospital, they didn't know her race or even her gender. These witnesses have never heard them use racist language or act in any racist ways, as if that's something that people openly do around family and friends and not behind closed doors to themselves. Come on, let's just use our common sense. Most people aren't openly racist. They do it on the down low, so people don't judge them and think they're horrible people even though they are. This trial lasted a total of 3 weeks. It was a long one with a lot of information to go over because the prosecution really had to prove their claims of human trafficking. Basically, that these kids were adopted so that they could be used as slaves. At the end of the trial, both sides made their closing arguments and the jury was sent for deliberation. When they came back, they found that 63-year-old Jeanne Whitefeather was in fact guilty on all charges, while 65-year-old Donald Lantz was guilty of all of his charges except the civil rights violations.
We, the jury, find the defendant Jeanne K. Whitefeather guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of human trafficking. We, the jury, find the defendant Donald Ray Lantz guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of human trafficking.
First time the human trafficking statutes have been charged in West Virginia, we believe, and the civil rights violations aren't charged very often in West Virginia. They're tough cases to prove, and we appreciate the help we got from everybody on the team.
So thankfully, there is justice being served for what those poor children went through. Unlike a lot of the cases that we cover, these children are still alive and they survived this. And thankfully, something was done before it was taken too far. But they went through so much pain and trauma in their first years just to be abused with the family who is supposed to provide them with a safe, loving home. I can only hope that those kids are getting the mental health help that I'm sure they desperately need. And as far as I could find, I think at least the oldest boy is, though again, I hope all of them are. I'm not sure the current situation they're in, besides that they are with CPS. I'm not sure if they found a more permanent home, so if anyone does know more, please do let us know down below. With their identities being hidden from us, we don't know who they are, and I think it's better that way, but that means that we don't necessarily know what happened to them after this. All we can do is just hope that they come out of this okay. Because this case went to trial so recently, we don't yet know the sentence they will receive, but I will let you all know in the description as soon as we get word. But that is all of the information I have on today's case, and now I really want to hear what you all think about this one. It's a doozy for sure, and I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of different opinions. So, do you think this couple adopted these children to use them as slaves? Do you think the couple was racist and targeted these children because of their race? Or do you think this started with good intentions and they were overwhelmed and started the abuse as a result? Let's discuss this and any other thoughts you have in the comments below. If you liked this video, please make sure to go ahead and leave this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime and mystery videos every single week. Don't forget to turn that notification bell on so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Make sure to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. All will be linked down below. And if you have any case suggestions, please make sure to fill out the Google form, which is also listed down below. With that, hope you guys have an amazing week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.